Hello there, dear listener, and welcome back to this quiet corner of history. Before we begin our journey tonight, I want to take a moment to greet you wherever you are in the world. Whether you are tucked beneath a warm blanket, drifting somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, or simply looking for a gentle companion to carry you through the night, I am so glad you found your way here. If you would like, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. It is always such a wonderful thing to see how far and wide this community of quiet history lovers stretches across the globe. And if this kind of slow, immersive storytelling is something you enjoy, please do consider subscribing so you never miss another journey into the past. But now, let us allow the noise and the brightness of the modern world to slowly fade away. Let the hum of technology grow distant. Let your breathing slow, and let your thoughts settle like leaves drifting down to still water. Because tonight, we are going back through the centuries, back through the ages, to a time when life moved at the pace of the seasons, when the rising of the sun meant the beginning of work, and the setting of it meant the end of everything a person could do in a single day. Tonight, we visit the medieval village. Picture it now, if you will. A cluster of small thatched cottages gathered along a muddy lane. Smoke curls lazily from every chimney, rising up into a sky the color of pale ash. Around the village, open fields stretch out in every direction, marked by low ridges of turned earth where the soil has been worked and reworked by the same families for generations. At the center of it all stands the church, its modest stone tower the tallest thing for miles in any direction. And beyond the fields, dark and vast and full of sounds that most villagers would rather not investigate, lies the forest. This is the world of the medieval peasant. And though it may look peaceful from a distance, it was anything but simple. Life in a medieval village was governed above all else by labor. From the moment a child was old enough to walk steadily, they were expected to contribute. There were animals to tend, fields to weed, water to carry, and wood to gather. There was no such thing as a day off, not truly, not in the way we might understand it today. Even on Sundays, when the church bells called the villagers to worship and the more exhausting forms of agricultural work were set aside, there were still fires to feed, animals to water, and infants to care for. The rhythms of the village were dictated entirely by the agricultural calendar. This was the great clock by which all medieval life was measured, turning slowly through its seasons, each one bringing its own particular set of demands and its own particular set of fears. Spring was the season of hope, but also of anxiety. After the long months of winter, the ground had to be broken again, the fields plowed and planted before the window of good weather closed. The oxen, gaunt and slow after months of limited feed, were hitched to the heavy plows and driven in long furrows across the open fields. The work was backbreaking. A man walking behind a plow in those days might cover 10 miles in a single day, his boots caked with mud, his shoulders aching, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if looking for something just beyond his reach. Sowing came next. Seeds were carried in broad, flat baskets and scattered by hand across the broken earth. Wheat and rye for bread, oats and barley for ale and porridge, beans and peas that would be dried and stored against the lean months. And then, after the sowing, came the long, anxious waiting. Waiting for rain, but not too much rain. Waiting for sun, but not too much sun. Watching the sky with a kind of desperate hopefulness that we who can simply walk to a grocery store can barely imagine. There was a man in the village of Little Barnum, we might imagine, by the name of Walter. He was perhaps 40 years old, though he looked older, his face deeply lined by weather and worry, his hands so calloused they barely felt the roughness of the plow handle anymore. Walter had worked this same strip of earth since he was old enough to be useful. His father had worked it before him, his grandfather before that. The field was not his, not exactly. Nothing truly belonged to the peasant in the way we understand ownership today. The land belonged to the lord of the manor, and Walter paid for his right to work it in labor, in grain, in 100 small obligations that followed him through every season of his life. And yet, for all that, Walter knew every inch of that field. He knew where the soil ran thin over rock, where it held water too long after heavy rain, where the earth was deepest and most generous. This knowledge, passed down through the generations like a kind of inheritance that no lord could take away, was perhaps the most valuable thing a medieval peasant could possess. Summer brought its own particular intensity to village life. The days were long and golden, and every hour of light was used. Hay had to be cut and gathered before rain could spoil it. The meadows rang with the sound of scythes, men and women working side by side in long rhythmic strokes, the cut grass falling in pale green waves. Children followed behind, turning the rows with wooden rakes so the hay dried evenly in the sun. Older villagers who could no longer manage the heavy work sat at the edge of the field and kept watch over the very smallest children, the babies too young to be left in the cottages alone. It is worth pausing here for a moment to think about the children of the medieval village, because their lives were both remarkably similar to and remarkably different from the childhoods we know today. Medieval children were expected to be useful from a very young age. By the time a child could walk reliably, they were already being given small tasks: gathering sticks, chasing birds from the seedlings, carrying water, watching younger siblings. There was no formal education for the children of peasants. Learning happened through watching and doing, through the long, slow transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next. A girl learned to spin wool by sitting at her mother's feet and watching, then being given her own small spindle and being shown again and again how to draw the thread out even and fine. A boy learned to read the weather by watching his father study the clouds, learned to judge when the soil was ready to work by plunging a fist into it and feeling its texture, learned which berries could be eaten and which ones would make you sick before supper. These were not small things. This was a kind of education, patient and practical and deep, and it was the only schooling most medieval children would ever receive. Among the most important figures in any medieval village was the miller. The mill sat at the edge of the village where the stream ran fast enough to turn the great wooden wheel, and to the mill came every family with their grain to be ground into flour. The miller was a powerful man, in the modest scale of village power, because he was necessary. Without him, there was no bread, and bread was life. But millers in medieval times had a reputation for dishonesty that was so widespread, it had become something close to a joke, though not a particularly funny one if you were on the receiving end. Millers were known for helping themselves to a generous portion of whatever grain they ground, skimming off a little extra from every batch that passed through their hands. It was so common that people simply expected it, building a kind of extra allowance into their calculations, the way you might today factor in the inevitable delays of a slow postal service. There is a story told of a miller named Edmund in a village near the river, who was so thorough in his skimming that his neighbors said he was the only man in the village who ate well even in the lean years. Edmund had a cheerful round face and an easy laugh, and he greeted everyone who brought grain to his mill with such warmth and goodwill that it was almost possible to forget that he was almost certainly robbing you. Almost. The village priest preached occasionally on the sin of dishonesty, and the miller sat in his pew with an expression of such sincere piety that the priest found it difficult to say anything too pointed without feeling somehow rude. This is not to say that all millers were dishonest, of course, but it illustrates something important about medieval village life, which is that within the constraints of a system that gave peasants very little control over their own lives, they found ways to maneuver, to negotiate, to carve out small advantages where they could. It was not always entirely honest, but it was very human. Autumn was the season that mattered most. Everything else in the agricultural year led to this: the harvest. When the grain was finally ripe, the entire village came together in a way that happened at no other time of year. Fields that were worked by individual families in their own strips were now brought under a kind of collective urgency. Everyone helped. The Lord sent his own workers out to join the villagers, and the work went on from first light to last, day after day, until every stalk had been cut and gathered, and the field stood stubbled and bare beneath the autumn sky. The cutting was done with sickles, short curved blades that the reapers gripped low to the ground. A good reaper could work for hours without stopping, falling into a rhythm that was almost meditative. The swish and cut of the blade, the gathering of the stalks, the binding into sheaves. But it was grueling work, and by evening the reapers' backs were in agony, their hands blistered even through calluses built up over years. After the cutting came the threshing, the beating of the grain from the stalks with heavy wooden flails. And after the threshing came the winnowing, the tossing of the grain into the air so the wind could carry away the chaff. These were jobs that could be done through the autumn and into winter, in the barn, when the outdoor work had slowed. And when the harvest was finally in, when the grain was measured and divided, when the Lord had taken his share and the church had taken its tithe and whatever remained had been carried carefully into the family storage, then came the briefest of celebrations. Harvest festivals were among the few times in the year when even the poorest peasant families might eat and drink something more than their daily minimum. There might be a shared feast on the village green, simple food, but more of it than usual. There might be music, a fiddle or a drum, and dancing, tired bodies moving with a kind of desperate joy, as if trying to store up pleasure against the long, hungry months ahead. And then winter came. We have spoken before of how cruel the medieval winter could be, how it pressed down on the poor like a cold, heavy hand, how the fire that provided the only warmth was never quite enough against the seeping chill of stone and earth. But winter in the village also had its quieter side. a strange, enforced stillness that was almost like rest, if rest could be defined as merely doing the hardest things more slowly. The agricultural work paused, mostly. There was little that could be done in the frozen fields, but there was still much to do inside and around the homestead. Animals needed feeding and watering, a task that became more difficult as water sources froze. Firewood needed constant replenishing. Tools needed mending. Thatch needed patching where the autumn rains had worked through it. And in the evenings, gathered close around the fire, the village came into a different kind of life. In summer, there was barely time to speak to your neighbors before exhaustion carried you to sleep. But in winter, there were long evenings, and with them came stories. The telling of stories was one of the great social arts of the medieval village. There were no books for most people, no written entertainments of any kind. What they had were the stories they carried in their heads, passed down from grandparents to parents to children, changing a little with each telling, growing richer and stranger over time. There were stories about the forest, about creatures that lived in the deep places where the light never fully reached. Stories about the founding of the village, embroidered and mythologized until the actual history was barely visible beneath the legend. Stories about saints and their miracles, about heaven and hell and the intermediate realms where the souls of the recently dead were said to linger. An old woman named Agnes, who had lived her entire life in the same village and who claimed to remember things that most people thought had happened before her time, was one of the great storytellers. She sat by her fire on the long winter evenings and told stories in a low voice, and the children of the village gathered at her feet and listened with wide eyes. Even the adults, who had heard the stories many times before, found themselves drawn in, because Agnes had the gift of making the familiar feel new, of bringing a detail to life with exactly the right word at exactly the right moment. She told about the year the summer never came, when the cold lingered through what should have been harvest time, and the grain rotted in the fields, and the village very nearly did not survive. She told it as though it had happened in her own lifetime, though even her most generous admirers suspected it had actually happened rather longer ago than that. She told about the family that had once lived in the old cottage at the edge of the wood, the one that had fallen to ruin now, and what had become of them. She told about the knight who had passed through the village once on his way to somewhere important, and how he had stopped at the well and spoken a few words to whoever happened to be nearby, and how those words had been analyzed and discussed and debated for decades afterward. These stories were the literature of the village. They were entertainment and history and moral instruction all at once, and they mattered in a way that is hard to overstate in a world where nearly everything else was uncertain. The church was the other great center of village life. It stood at the center of the village both physically and spiritually, and the priest was in many ways the most important single figure in the community. He was educated, or at least more educated than almost anyone else around him. He could read and write, skills that in the medieval village were rare enough to seem almost magical. He kept records of births and deaths and marriages, held in trust the collective memory of the community in a more formal way than even the storytellers. But the medieval village priest was also very much a part of the community he served. In the small country parishes, The priest was often a man of humble background, not so very different from the people he ministered to. He might have his own small plot of land, grow his own vegetables, keep his own chickens. He was not distant or elevated so much as he was simply designated, set apart by his function rather than entirely by his nature. The church calendar gave the village year its emotional shape. Christmas, Easter, midsummer feasts, the days of local patron saints. These marked the turning of the year with moments of special intensity, occasions when the ordinary routine was suspended and something else, something larger, was briefly felt. Even the smallest of these occasions, the celebration of a saint whose name most of the villagers could barely pronounce, provided a welcome break from the relentless forward motion of the agricultural year. And the church provided comfort in a world where comfort was in genuinely short supply. When a child died, which happened with terrible frequency, the church offered the framework through which grief could be expressed and then, eventually, survived. When the harvest failed and the family's carefully laid plans began to unravel, prayer was at least something that could be done when nothing else could. Whether it helped, in the literal sense, is not for us to say, but that it helped in the human sense. The sense of giving suffering a meaning and a context seems almost certain. Death was never far from the medieval village. This is perhaps the starkest difference between that world and our own. The sheer proximity of mortality in everyday life. Children died with heartbreaking regularity. Illness that we would today consider minor, a chest infection, a broken bone that did not heal properly, could kill. The hazards of agricultural work were constant and serious. Accidents with animals, with tools, with the everyday machinery of village life, claimed lives with a frequency that we can barely imagine today. And yet, the medieval village was not a place defined by despair. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing. People loved each other, raised children, made plans, told jokes, argued about trivial things, fell in love, argued about nothing at all with the particular relish that neighbors everywhere seemed to reserve for disputes over boundaries and water rights. Life went on, and going on was itself a kind of triumph. There is something in this that speaks to a quality of the human spirit that has not changed very much in the centuries between that world and our own. The capacity to find meaning and connection in small things. The ability to laugh in difficult circumstances. The stubborn persistence of hope in the face of evidence that hope may not be entirely warranted. The medieval peasant knew that the winter would be hard. They knew it every year. They knew it, and they prepared for it as best they could. And when it came anyway and was harder than they had prepared for, they endured it. And when spring came again, and it always did come again, they felt something that was probably very close to what we would feel. A lightening of spirit, a return of possibility, a quiet gratitude for having made it through. As the evenings grow longer and the world outside your window grows quiet, consider for a moment the village of 800 years ago, settling into its own nightly stillness. The fires burning low in the cottages, the animals breathing softly in their pens, the children asleep in their straw, exhausted from a day spent in the fields or gathering or simply running, as children in every age have run, for the joy of it. The medieval village was not a golden age. It was hard and uncertain and often frightening, but it was also human in the deepest sense of the word. The people who lived there were not so different from us as the centuries might suggest. They loved their children and worried about the future and found moments of unexpected laughter in the middle of their difficulties. They told stories and argued with their neighbors and sat by their fires on cold nights and looked into the flames and thought about things they could not quite put into words. And now they are gone. All of them. Every person who ever lived in that village has slipped away into the past, leaving behind nothing but the faint outlines in the earth where their buildings once stood, and the stories we piece together from fragments and guesses. But in some quiet way, they are still here, in the long chain of human experience that connects them to us, in the unchanging rhythms of season and harvest and rest, in the way that Firelight still feels, after all this time, like the most natural and comforting thing in the world. Rest now, dear listener. The village is quiet. The last fire is burning down to embers. The night is long and soft, and there is nothing you need to do until morning. Let the old world hold you for a while and drift away into the dark. Sweet dreams, and I will see you next time for another slow walk through the corridors of history. Good night.